You are listening to the Centropic Oracle, an audiobook podcast of science fiction and fantasy short stories that make you think and feel.
The Green Infinity by Alexandra Renwick. The helicopter's thrumming vibrated through Sharon's body with teeth-rattling insistence. She gripped the handhold and looked out the window at the seemingly endless, undulating green jungle which had once been her husband. California's population had fled. Pockets of survivors huddled on rooftops against encroaching vines and climbing stalks, awaiting airlift rescue. The verdant growth continued to spread, radiating outward in a pattern reminiscent of wildfire or of contagion. They tried fire, of course, to stop him. Water, fungicide, herbicide, electricity, planes, and tankers of all sizes and functions pressed into service to halt the relentless creeping green. Sharon was the government's last resort. Second last, actually, though dropping a nuclear bomb on California seemed unfathomable. "Oh, Gary," Sharon murmured, her words swallowed by the helicopter's chopping drone. Back when it was still just quickly spreading cancer, they battled. No drug or therapy or voodoo spirit prayer had helped. Gary had faced death with dignity and courage. It was Sharon who'd urged him to try experimental DNA recombinant chromosomal therapies using gene splices from Pueraria lobata, common kudzu. Even now, even with this, it was hard to feel she'd been wrong. Colonel Bradley touched her shoulder. He gestured directly down into the lushness below. She saw her reflection in the wide, ovoid mirrors of his aviator shades as she read his lips. Ground Zero, he pointed again into the green. Ground Zero was the hospital with its helipad roof. Her husband's hyper-rapid cellular growth had ruptured windows, choked all egresses, and smothered the brick siding, but he was for the most part a ground cover plant. The rooftop was bare. Colonel Bradley jumped down and assisted Sharon out. They crouched under whipping wind and noisy rotor blades, Sharon resisting the urge to wave as the helicopter drew up and away. The silence when her ears stopped ringing was almost painful. Colonel Bradley stood at polite attention, gaze directed elsewhere, granting her privacy. He was brave, she thought, and kind. Silence of the world smothered by Gary was more complete than the silence of deserted beaches or wild forests. No birdsong, no insect buzz or rushing water, only the gentle shuckling of Gary's wide, glossy leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. The sun was perfect, golden and high, sky that amazing eternal blue never captured in paint or film, consisting mainly of light and open space. Colonel Bradley cleared his throat and glanced sideways, apologetic. "Ma'am, our ride returns in exactly 28 minutes. Sharon wanted to touch his arm, let him know it was all right. She didn't blame him for what was to come. Gary's body, anything remotely recognizable as physically human, had disappeared in the first minutes of his transformation. As she and the medical team watched, his flesh had turned greenish, then green, then a shriveled brown husk as it was sucked into the tendrils sprouting from his pores. Millions of tendrils, first the size of green hairs, then growing larger with astonishing rapidity. Sharon walked to the rooftop edge. She closed her eyes and breathed deep, sunlight on her shoulders, chlorophyll musk in the air. It smelled like Gary, the insides of his wrists, the hollow of his throat, his hair and clothes. She glanced over her shoulder. Colonel Bradley stood across the helipad with military rigidity, hands locked behind his back, facing away. His short hair was stiff. but wind rippled his shirt across his back in a repeating pattern, like sands blowing across a khaki desert. She turned again toward the green infinity. As far as she could see, all was greenness. Beneath lay abandoned, candy-bright cars, dirty black asphalt, billboards and advertisements of all stripes and colors. Never had the city looked so serene. Sharon ran a finger along a lagoon-like tendril curling up over the roof ledge, a delicate emerald corkscrew. "Carrie," she said. Came out softer than she'd intended, more wistful. "I know you are still in here somewhere. Can you hear me? You must stop this." Warm breezes whipped her words from her lips. She imagined them swirling out across the dappled green ocean, sinking into the rustling stalks and pulpy flesh of questing vines. "Gary, I'm sorry I didn't listen when you were ready to go. I know you took experimental treatments for my sake." Wind flapped her hair across her eyes. Rustling grew louder, the vegetation dancing in current, sunlight glancing off green leaves. "I couldn't before, but I can now. I let you go freely. Thank you for staying as long as you could, but you were right. I was wrong. Forgive me." Without realizing, Sharon had gripped tight the raised roof ledge. At a tickle against the back of her knuckles, she glanced down. A curving tendril pushed into her hand. It looked like time-lapse photography when a seed unfurls into a plant in seconds. She opened her palm, and the tendril formed in her cupped hand as she watched. She closed her fingers around the fuzzy bean-like thing. The vine detached itself, browned, shriveled, and fell away. She shoved her hands into her pockets and turned at the sound of the helicopter approaching. Colonel Bradley ducked and ran across to take her arm as the helicopter landed. She allowed herself to be helped up, buckled in. Leaning into the bubble glass window, Sharon saw tendrils questing up toward them as they lifted, corkscrew curls leaping after them into the air like slender green streamers tossed at a parade. Colonel Bradley studied her face. Keeping her expression neutral, she nodded. He returned the nod and settled into his seat. Twisting to look at the receding rooftop, Sharon watched the brown of dead vine widen from ground zero in an expanding ring as rapidly as the green had initially spread. It nearly kept pace with the departing helicopter. Sharon leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, fingers curling tight around the soft, slender seed pod in her pocket.
We hope you enjoyed The Green Infinity by Alexandra Renwick, read by Candice Hunter. If you'd like to make a donation to the author and narrator of this story, check out the story page link in the description and click the PayPal donate button, or pledge your support to us directly on Patreon. Would you like to submit a story to the Centropic Oracle? A link to our submission guidelines can be found in the description.